Okay. For all vertebrates that we talk about, whether we're talking about sharks, bony fish, we're talking about amphibians, reptiles, mammals, whatever the vertebrate is that we're talking about, all vertebrates have 5 regions to their brain. For all of these, the first is the telencephalon. This is probably the region we're most familiar with when we're thinking about a brain. If we look at the mammalian brain, this large area here is the cerebrum and the cerebral hemispheres. Okay? The cerebrum is the telencephalon. When you're thinking about a brain, you're likely thinking about the telencephalon. On the other end of the brain, you have the olfactory nerves. Here is one of the olfactory nerves. This is actually the olfactory bulb, and then there's an olfactory tract. All right? If we were to look at the shark brain, here's the shark brain. The very top structure is the olfactory sacs. We then have the olfactory tract, which is behind the olfactory bulb, which is the slight swelling of the olfactory tract as it runs into the olfactory sac. And that's connecting to the 2 big bulbs of the actual brain, the most anterior portion of the brain, which is the cerebrum. Okay, do not fall. All right, so that's the cerebrum. The cerebrum is where olfaction is being processed. When we start getting to mammalian brains, they're a lot larger. All right? There's a lot more going on within the mammalian brain, more than just processing olfactory information, but it's also all of the sensory information, all of the motor output. A lot of that is being integrated and processed here within the cerebrum. All right? All of these folds are called gyri. A single one would be a gyrus. And within there, we can start dividing the brain up into different regions that do different structures, which we're not going to talk about. I think somebody kicked the light switch on the bottom. Okay. If we were to go from a shark brain, which you saw the cerebrum here on the actual shark, this is the cerebrum right here. The cerebrum is much smaller on the shark than it is on the mammal, and not using the word primitive, but more ancestral characteristic is what we see with the shark. As we start going through evolutionary time, and we start seeing things become more derived, we're starting to see an increase in the telencephalon. We don't see much change in all the other 5 regions of the brain. The biggest change we see is within the telencephalon. Okay? Behind the telencephalon, this gap right in here, this would be the diencephalon. All right? And there is actual parts to the diencephalon if we take a look at the mammalian brain. This right here coming off would be the optic nerve, and the optic nerves come together at that crisscross. Let's draw that on the board real quick. You would have an optic nerve coming in, another optic nerve coming in, and then they're going to crisscross right at what's called the optic chiasm. Okay? What your brain, not your brain, what your eye is picking up on the right side of your body is transferred to the right optic nerve, which then crisscrosses and is actually processed by the left side of your brain because of this crisscross at the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm is part of the diencephalon. This area here is the diencephalon. If we look at the shark brain, you can see where that string is attached at the top of the brain there, holding the brain to this plexiglass that's within there. Behind that string is the optic nerve and the optic chiasm. That would be the diencephalon. It's really small to see on the shark brain. That's why we showed it on the mammal brain first. Okay? Going back to the mammal brain, this area here, and same with the shark, would be the hypothalamus. If I went more dorsal, deeper to that, you would have the thalamus. The thalamus and the hypothalamus, we're going to get a lot of endocrine control of hormones throughout the body. The pituitary gland would be coming off of this region here, but it was likely pulled off when we extracted the brain from the skull and the membrane around the brain. Okay? There's more portions to the brain, but we're not going to go into those in more depth. just know the basics of the diencephalon there. The other part, though, that you need to know about the diencephalon is deep within all of that, you have something called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is where cerebral spinal fluid is being produced. That's going to be bathing the inside of the brain through the ventricles. It's going to be bathing the outside of the brain, and it's going to be bathing the spinal cord through the dorsal hollow nerve cord. Okay? All right. The next part that we have is the mesencephalon. This here is the mesencephalon. Okay? If we look at the shark brain, this is the mesencephalon. All right? The mesencephalon is also called the optic lobes. You're going to have the ocular motor nerve coming off here. You're going to have the trochlear nerve coming off here. We're having integration of the sensory information that we picked up by the optic nerve, and we're creating motor output now through the optic lobes. If we continue back even further, we have the metencephalon. The metencephalon is probably the second most well-known structure of the brain. That's the cerebellum. Okay? If we were to look at the shark brain, this entire top part here is the cerebellum. That is the metencephalon. All right? The metencephalon also is going to include the pons. This is the pons. All right. We will have the trigeminal nerve coming off of the pons. All right, and we'll talk about the trigeminal nerve in just a bit. We continue back even further. We now have the medulla oblongata. This is part of the myelencephalon. And if we look at the shark brain, this is all the myelencephalon. If we go even further back, this is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is covered by myelin sheaths, which help relay the electrical message faster down the spinal nerve, the axon of that nerve. That myelin sheath continues up and actually covers part of the medulla oblongata, which is why it has the name myelencephalon. It's an easy way to remember that. You can also remember that S comes before T, so the mesencephalon comes before the metencephalon. And the myelencephalon is the last part. All of the rest of the cranial nerves we haven't talked about yet come off of the myelencephalon.